Back in 1998 there was a lot going on around the world. Some news topics around the world for that year, for an idea of what happened back then, include the MMR vaccine panic, the signing of the Good Friday Agreement, the formation of the European Central Bank, the Clinton-Lewinsky scandal, the founding of Google, and the Winter Olympics held in Nagano, and the FIFA World Cup held across France. It was also an especially significant year in pop culture. Motion pictures such as Titanic, Saving Private Ryan, and Armageddon were raking in the big bucks around the world, and in the music world, Lauryn Hill had her solo debut, Björk was well into her Homogenic tour, Britney Spears became the new MTV darling, and Oasis came crashing down to earth following the conclusion of their Be Here Now tour. If we are specific to Japan for a moment, you have films such as Ring, directed by Hideo Nakata, Perfect Blue, directed by Satoshi Kon, and Love and Pop, directed by Hideaki Anno. Musically, it also signalled the passing of the torch from the idols of the 1980s to pop stars such as Namie Amuro, Ayumi Hamasaki, Hikaru Utada, and Shiina Ringo. There was a definite cultural shift taking place around the world at this time, and not everyone was quite ready for what was to come after all of this, but situated right in the perfect spot to take full advantage of this shift in culture was, not least of all, the video game industry. The near-complete shift towards 3D graphics enabled games to become more experimental than they once were, whilst providing players with a greater degree of immersion than before. As a result, you get a game like the one I'm going to cover shortly, but before that, let me talk about the guy who led its development. In 1986, a young Hideo Kojima, fresh off his university studies in economics, took a job at Konami to develop video games, a job which often saw him as the butt of jokes due to how the games industry was perceived at the time, as little more than a toy factory. Despite that, he saw it as a medium with a lot of potential, and got hired by Konami to make games for the MSX computer, beginning with Penguin Adventure, a simple action-adventure game where you avoid hazards in different environments to reach the end of each stage. Right after that, in 1987, he was given a brief to design an action game, also for the MSX. The problem, however, was that the MSX wasn't really capable of smooth side-scrolling that you would expect to see on a home console of the time. As a compromise, he opted to make a game focused around stealth instead of out-and-out action. Thus, Metal Gear was born. Although it was an important game in its own right, compared to what we know of the franchise today, Metal Gear was initially an isolated affair, intended to be a one-and-done game to make way for his next game, Snatcher. Initially releasing on the NEC PC-88 series of computers, followed eventually by releases on other systems, Snatcher was the game that gave Kojima the chance to stretch his legs as a writer and make a game focused on a narrative he derived from his influences instead of simply designing for compromise. As you could probably tell, he grew up with a tremendous love for many different kinds of media, most notably books and films. As it happens, he wanted to make films at first, but didn't have a way into the movie industry directly. To compromise, he wanted to make games that tapped into his influences where possible. Bringing it back to Metal Gear, the original game got a heavily altered port for the Nintendo Entertainment System, intended for release in the West. This is in spite of the original MSX version also releasing in Europe. The NES version sold pretty well, but Kojima was none too thrilled about many of the changes that were made. It bore practically no resemblance to the original, and followed a wholly different tale in a very different setting. The story goes that Kojima was informed by a co-worker on a train ride that Konami were developing a sequel to the NES version called Snake's Revenge, and thus suggested to Kojima to make a sequel to the MSX original as a rival to the NES version sequel that was in development. Metal Gear 2 Solid Snake released in 1990, featuring a considerable number of innovations on the original game, including improved gameplay systems, such as stealth operating through cones of vision instead of direct line of sight, and a partially persistent world, where the rooms adjacent to your current location have things going on at the same time. Also, it had an absolutely killer soundtrack. Following a brief diversion with Policenauts, a point-and-click adventure game that took after Snatcher, he laid down the groundwork for a game that would be a continuation of the Metal Gear series that he hadn't even intended to progress beyond the first game, but circumstances conspired to keep him on this road. Right now though, I think it's best that I stopped rambling about Hideo Kojima's early time in the industry and focus on introducing the game that ultimately signalled his arrival in the eyes of the mainstream. Metal Gear Solid. Released in 1998 for the Sony PlayStation, Metal Gear Solid is the third mainline entry in the Metal Gear series. It's a stealth action game in which you take control of Solid Snake to infiltrate the Shadow Moses Island complex to deal with terrorists. Plans for a third Metal Gear game went through varying degrees of incubation, including an intention to make it for the 3DO interactive multiplayer. Naturally, that one fell through, but eventually he found a way forward in the PlayStation, and so work began in earnest during the production of Policenauts. A somewhat unusual name, he opted to use the term Solid to signal that not only was this the third installment, like gas, liquid and solid phases, but the transition from a 2D projection to a fully modelled 3D environment gave it a rather solid feeling, presumably in contrast to the more flat look the MSX titles imparted. You navigate this environment to stealthily take down foes whilst also avoiding them like the plague where possible, because getting into a fight is something you are not prepared to deal with by and large. As you play through the game, a story unfolds that changes your perspective on not just the game in itself, but even games as a medium, by doing things that were either uncommon or awkward before Metal Gear Solid did them, or were simply notorious to the point of being a legend. As a game, it made use of a lot of techniques that weren't well established at the time, but eventually became mainstays since appearing here, with cutscenes that feature voice work by established professional actors. Today, its reception in the press sees it as a mainstay in lists of the best games on the PlayStation, and in some publications stands as one of the best games, if not the best, of all time, and its status today as a fulcrum point for the medium's ability to present narrative is simply accepted. During the game's launch, it was of course still received with acclaim, and it went on to win a good number of awards throughout its life, and it put Hideo Kojima on the map and in the eyes of the mainstream. Critics at the time enjoyed the ways in which cutscenes were presented and also liked the challenge that different situations presented, but some were critical towards the short length of the game itself, and frequent corner cutting with regards to how dialogue can be presented. Despite those issues, at 7 million units sold, it is the 10th best-selling game on the PlayStation, nestled in good company with the Crash Bandicoot and Tomb Raider games, selling similar numbers of copies, so not only was it well received, but sold very well in its day. It's a game that has been covered to a point of near exhaustion, complete with explorations of its themes and ideas. But I'm here to tackle it in my own way, to see if there is something I can provide that is maybe a little less well known or posited, though I highly doubt I am remotely close to being the first to say anything that I put forward in this review, such as the extent to which has been talked about already. Anyway, it's about time I brought this preamble to a close. After all, it's been dragging on for a fair while. So what better way to end this bit than with a look at the game's packaging? This particular box is quite peculiar, as the cover is not presented in the usual way, where the logo would be set along the horizontal. Instead, it's set along the vertical, so you have to rotate the box 90 degrees anti-clockwise to read it normally. The logo is set into the paper with a reflective aspect, making the logo stand out in a fairly unique way. Perhaps it's like this so as to catch attention, or maybe it was slightly cheaper doing it vertically this way, I don't know. It's an odd cover whose oddness is compounded by just how empty it is. You got the game's elevator pitch in the form of tactical espionage action and a logo written with a bold sci-fi typeface, and that's it. Moving on to the back, we have a lot more going on. A bunch of text explaining the game to us, as well as a selection of images that give us an even better idea of what to expect, followed by a warning notice, and Kojima's name, itself also arguably a warning. The images themselves are fairly dark, but given the nature of the game, that's not exactly avoidable. They are fairly big images at least, so seeing what is in them isn't too difficult. You can see different modes of sneaking, combat and interaction with things in the environment and dialogue. It's a clean presentation style that would be maintained for the most part by the series going forward, in part because it's nice and elegant, but also because it's clear, clean and easy to understand. You get a good idea of what it is you're putting yourself in for, in spite of the quiet cover. Now, this game is in a multi-CD jewel case, so looking inside, we see it contains not one, not even two, but 3 CDs here. The third disc is simply a demo disc for one of the greatest role-playing games ever made, Suikoden 2. But for the purposes of this review, this is all we're talking about regarding it. We do have the 2 game discs on the front side in black with white text, or white with black text, complete with a big, shiny kanji. Now, fun fact time, these are the kanji for 1 and 2. You're probably familiar with seeing the characters Ichi and Ni looking like this, but imagine that you were working with a legal document and dealing with numbers, and wanted to avoid some ne'er-do-well adding another line in all of that to inflate it. It's basically an inbuilt security feature. Anyway, the paper stuff is in the back side of the box, so let's grab it all and look through it. We see our usual stuff, including an obi that broke, a Konami survey card, a pamphlet for the Suikoden 2 demo, a set of stickers, and the thing we're most interested in right now, the instruction manual. The manual is quite illustrative, featuring fairly large images that show what is going on in different sequences. It even goes as far as to explain how the different camera perspectives work based on the situation. It's a really good manual because, in spite of there being a rather meagre amount of English, you can make use of the images to understand what is in this game. You will still benefit a great deal from being able to read Japanese, but it's not an absolute requirement to be able to get something out of this manual. For now though, I think it would be a good idea to move on to beginning the game, so let's begin our journey with Metal Gear Solid. Upon starting Metal Gear Solid, we hear a nice little jingle as we see a couple Konami logos, reminding us of a better time and leaving us reminiscing on what was. But that's in the distant future, so let's focus on what happens in the game. The game gives us a quiet, almost serene opening, before all of a sudden we're caught off guard by the sound of a submarine rushing by in the waters of the Bering Sea, off the coast of Alaska. A disembodied voice provides us with details on objectives for an upcoming mission, before we are launched like a torpedo from the submarine. It eventually opens up to allow us, its occupant, to swim towards its target, and the cutscene fades out to bring us to the game's menu. There isn't a lot for us to be going over at this immediate time in the menu. There is only so much we can roll with. As a result, let's get going and let us begin a new game. You may have noticed that there isn't a difficulty select. I'll explain quite a ways off from now, because for now, we have a mission to complete. As we swim into a dock, we hear someone preparing to ascend an elevator as they talk to a guard. As the elevator ascends, we remove some of our gear, hunker down, and talk on a device called a codec to report to our commander and confirm that we have landed ashore. We are given instructions from Colonel Campbell to make our way to the surface from the dock using the elevator. We have to wait a while before it descends again, so let's mooch about the docks for a moment. This opening section serves as the first part of a tutorial. It's fairly representative of the game as a whole, and it features guards on patrol routes, making sure no funny business is going on. After a time, the elevator descends. Your ticket to the surface has arrived, but don't be too hasty, as a new guard shows up to reinforce the 2 here. When you get the opportunity, head for the elevator and ride it to the top. Now, you can begin the game. Or more accurately, you'll be able to once this conversation is completed. To be fair, it's not like it isn't worthwhile, as you get an explanation of how to handle the next couple segments of the game, as you're introduced to not just binoculars, but you're also introduced to the Soliton radar in the top right corner of the screen. More on this thing later, as we have to make our way through an environment that includes patrols which can see your footprints in the snow, spotlights that can raise an alarm if you encroach upon them, security cameras that make things tricky to reach, and a couple entryways that are hard to access. I'm going to use this opportunity to explain the controls now that we are in a more open environment. This game has support for the standard PlayStation controller, as well as the dual analog controller and DualShock controller. The D-pad and left analog stick move Snake in the direction you press. The face buttons are also fairly simple. The X button allows you to crouch or go prone. You can't move crouched, but you can crawl along the ground, which is useful for navigating tight spaces like vents or curious hiding places. The triangle button brings you to first person view. In this game it's used more for getting your bearings than anything else. You are fixed in place and can't really use any of your weapons. Speaking of weapons, combat. The square and circle buttons are fairly multi-layered in their use. The square button is used for when you have a weapon equipped, allowing you to fire your gun or throw a grenade, or for performing a CQC maneuver on a given opponent, depending on the direction that you're attacking from. The circle button is a bit simpler in that it is used in combat to perform punches and even a kick if you press it repeatedly enough. The other utility it has is for interacting with the world, such as pressing elevator buttons or climbing ladders. I mentioned weapons a moment ago, so let's talk about that very briefly. I'll leave the specific weapons out of it for now. What matters is the menu system. Hold the R2 shoulder button to open the weapons menu and use the D-pad to cycle through your available weapons, and release it to exit the menu with the selected weapon equipped. You can use the L2 button in a similar fashion for browsing other items, such as your rations, binoculars, and whatever other tools you pick up along the way. The L1 and R1 buttons quickly equip and unequip the particular item or weapon you have selected. The last button we will mention is the Select button, which sets up your codec. You have a simple interface to work with. Press left or right to set a target frequency, press up or circle to call, or press down to navigate an address book of contacts. Around this game's launch in 1998, the market for stealth games was only starting to be tapped into. Predating this game by a few months was Acquire's ninja-themed Tenchu Stealth Assassins. Tenchu focused on you being a sneaky little rascal to assassinate targets without arousing suspicion and getting involved in combat. Metal Gear Solid differs in the sense that you don't strictly need to kill many enemies in this game. Rather, you're presented with the option of eliminating enemies that happen to be in the way, although fighting bosses is required in order to progress. Another stealth game that released around the time of Metal Gear Solid was in some respects the magnum opus of stealth games from a gameplay perspective, Looking Glass Studios' Thief the Dark Project. The nature of the stealth gameplay in Thief is in some respects similar, but in others it differs dramatically. For example, hiding out of sight is a key component in both games for remaining undetected, but the ways in which enemies can spot you differ. For example, in Metal Gear Solid, you stay out of sight by hiding away in little nooks and crannies underneath things and generally staying away from everything, as well as avoiding making especially loud noises through walking on metal grates or knocking on walls, although these can have their advantages in places. Thief the Dark Project is a bit more advanced by comparison in that the chance of detection is predicated on variables instead of particular triggers. Are you in an area that is too well lit? Are you walking on a solid noisy floor or something carpeted? Metal Gear Solid is, by and large, not nearly this nuanced. Where enemies and guards in Thief are reacted to things around them, Metal Gear Solid's lot are reacted to things that are a bit simpler to figure out, such as the aforementioned footprints in the snow or a noisy grate or knock. A bullet going by a guard isn't going to attract its attention here. A guard in Thief would react to an arrow whizzing by its head. That isn't to say that the stealth gameplay in Metal Gear Solid isn't nuanced at all, however. Stealth gameplay is a hallmark of the franchise, so it at least tries to keep the player on their toes with a few aspects that the franchise is especially known for. If you enter the vision cone of an enemy or security camera, you will trigger an alert phase. Enemy combatants will head towards you to attempt to eliminate you, and your options are to try to repel them in combat or find somewhere to hide. Your Soliton radar becomes useless too, so you have to use your wits to get out of that sticky wicket. Also, bear in mind, if guards see you going under something to hide, they will just fish you out from your hole with grenades. They're pretty clever in trying to eliminate the threat that you pose to these guards. If you do manage to stay out of the way of guards for a moment, you'll enter an evasion phase, where a timer will count down to 0. In this phase there will be a frantic search for you, and when time's up and you aren't spotted again, everyone will return to their original positions and continue their usual patrol. A good comparison point between Metal Gear Solid and Thief the Dark Project is that in Thief, it is instilled early on that combat is to not just be avoided when possible, but feared. You're not an elite soldier, but a thief armed with a pitiable sword, so combat is awkward to discourage using it to face challenges head on. In Metal Gear Solid, however, you're playing as that elite soldier, so you have considerable amounts more stuff at your disposal. As you progress through the game, you will acquire a veritable arsenal of weaponry that you can pull out from hammer space and use against your target du moment. Your first encounters will be with little in the way of armament, as you're sent in with nothing besides your dukes, so you'll pick up weapons along the way, starting with simple things such as a handgun and an assault rifle, before heading all the way to heavier things like 2 different kinds of rocket launcher. Depending on the weapon you have equipped, your mode of combat will change. You may be able to use melee attacks alongside your weapons if they are small arms or projectiles, or things will change with the aforementioned launchers. To fire a weapon, simply press the square button. If you are using the SOCOM pistol, pressing the square button repeatedly will fire off a sequence of shots, whereas the FAMAS requires you to hold the square button down for fully automatic fire. With the projectiles and explosives you get, you have access to a reasonable array of different tools for the situations you find yourself in. Grenades are your traditional "this thing dies" weapon, whereas stun grenades will immobilize guards caught near it for a brief moment, and chaff grenades disrupt cameras and guidance systems for a time. You can also get C4 plastic explosive, which is used by crouching down to set it on the floor, or by pressing yourself against a wall with it equipped. It'll look like you're about to mount the C4 to that wall. Press the square button to set it and move away before pressing the circle button to detonate it. Another explosive weapon available to you is the Claymore. It's a mine that can be planted onto the ground, and if an enemy walks into its snare, it detonates. Be aware that it can also affect you, and they also fill out certain environments. They also have a camouflage system, so have fun with that. The Nikita missile launcher is a somewhat complicated device. You can run with it, but once you fire it, you're stationary for as long as the missile is not yet detonated. Using the D-pad or analog stick, you can guide it to where you need it to go, and you can use a first-person view to see from the perspective of the missile. The other 2 weapons will bring you to first-person view immediately upon arming them. The Stinger launcher fires rockets at targets. It features an optional lock-on system, and aiming is done with the D-pad or analog stick. The last weapon I'll cover is the PSG-1 sniper rifle. It's a somewhat shaky thing to use, you might notice, and we'll get to remedying that shortly, but the long and short of it is a long-range weapon intended to be used at a distance. The great thing about this set of weapons is there's no redundancy. Every single weapon you acquire is useful in some way, and even when that weapon's usefulness is seemingly done for, it can sometimes surprise you just how useful they can be. As for using the weapons, you can clearly tell the focus here is to discourage combat, since combat can be somewhat awkward. Despite that, it handles well enough for what it's going for. You're definitely vulnerable, but most situations have an avenue of escape, whether it be through just gunning down anyone you encounter, or by hiding somewhere and hoping nobody notices. Either way, combat can be a valid option. It stands in juxtaposition to a game like Thief the Dark Project, where getting into a combat situation, especially with 2 or more combatants, is tantamount to a bloody violent suicide. There are some situations, however, where using weaponry is either discouraged or disallowed. On Shadow Moses Island is a building dedicated to the storage and disposal of nuclear warheads. Because of that, you are made incapable of equipping a weapon to prevent you from causing some serious damage. On the whole, the game can make great use of tension in combat situations. You are never guaranteed to succeed, especially not early on, so you have to take the game seriously, particularly in stealth and combat. So how about we talk about some items that can help you along the way? Weapons are of course not the only things you can get in this game. Throughout this game you will pick up a collection of items that will be of great use through your time playing Metal Gear Solid. You only really start out with items like a pair of binoculars, which can be used to spot things from a distance, and a packet of cigarettes. Old habits die hard, so you may as well light up a ciggy and sit right back. Or don't, because that's a ticket to lung cancer. You'll pick up an array of different items though, with the most ubiquitous type being rations. Rations are a mainstay in the Metal Gear series as they serve as a healing item, providing a good amount of health back. They are also a safety net. If you take damage enough to normally kill you, equipped rations will automatically keep you going. It's not the only consumable item you can get because you can also pick up some diazepam. Now, ordinarily I wouldn't be casually recommending the use of benzos, but in this game they do serve a purpose as a muscle relaxant. Now you know how the sniper rifle is kept steady, but be aware that the effects don't last long. Outside of consumables, however, you also get different kinds of visual aid in the form of two types of goggles, night vision and thermal. I personally don't use night vision much because it blows everything up way too bright, but thermal goggles serve a number of useful purposes, as you can use them to detect things that give off a heat signature. There's also a mine detector. It makes use of the soliton radar to highlight the snare zones of armed mines. It's a fairly simple tool with some use, but its purpose is better handled by the thermal goggles. Outside of one situation in particular that is far outside of the scope of this section. One item that gives this game an almost Metroidvania vibe is the security card. Throughout the game, you acquire incrementally more potent security cards that provide access to rooms and areas of the base that were otherwise gated off to you, eventually opening up the entire base to you after a while. One slightly annoying feature of the card, however, is that it requires you to have it equipped in order to use it. It makes running around in certain areas of the game a bit bothersome, but it's not the worst offence in the world. At least it's just one card. On the running around in certain areas bit, there are items that can help with that, such as the gas mask. If you end up in a situation that results in a room being flooded with gas, then good news! You can use this to make your situation less grim. Or more drawn out depending on the specific situation. Another wearable device is body armour. With it equipped, you take a reduction in damage, helping to minimise the issue with thinning supplies late on in the game. You'll just have to make sure that you don't forget to heal up every once in a while, since things will still hurt a bit, but usually not quite enough to knock you for 6. There are a couple novelty items like the aforementioned cigarettes, but there is also a digital camera you can pick up. You can take photos with it and save them onto your memory card. It doesn't do a lot to be honest, but it's kinda neat. And of course, what Metal Gear game would be complete without the selection of cardboard boxes you can get throughout the game? Pop yourself inside one and run around like a kid in a desolate Toys R Us. On the whole, you get a pretty decent array of items that help in getting through this game. There are a couple others that you can get, but it's best that I wait until later on to be able to talk about them. We're still a ways off from that sort of stuff anyway, so let me talk about a core aspect of this game: the presentation. When it comes to the Metal Gear series, one of the things that gets invariably mentioned about this game, along with most others in this series, is the way in which things are presented, and a lot of it has to do with the things that inspired this game and series in the first place. Hideo Kojima makes no bones about his love for movies. From a very young age, he watched movies virtually every night of many different kinds, be they thrilling kaiju movies like Toho's Godzilla franchise, thrillers like Taxi Driver, and especially science fiction epics like 2001: A Space Odyssey. As a result, the presentation in this game is very strongly influenced by the language of cinema. Close-up shots of characters in dialogue provide a sense of intimacy and presence. Panning shots provide the player with a sense of perspective in given situations. Dutch angles are used to evoke fear and unease in the player, and so on. The majority of the cutscenes that appear in the game are in-engine, none of it is pre-rendered, and the only other kind of footage you get is some archive footage that bridges the gap between the game and the larger world the story takes place in. The cinematic influence extends to the characters to a somewhat overt extent at times, but it's clear this is all from a place of adoration of the medium. It's a game that proudly wears its influences on its sleeves. Snake, for example, was much inspired by Snake Plissken from John Carpenter's Escape from New York, whilst his appearance is inspired by the likes of Jean-Claude Van Damme and, curiously, Christopher Walken. There's doubtless a shade of James Bond in there too, as if this chaotic cocktail didn't have enough booze in it already. You also get a character like Otacon, who is the embodiment of this idea of a guy who's caught up in stuff against his will, though his love for robots in anime partly led him down that road to begin with. Be careful what you wish for. I'll avoid going too much deeper into characters for now though, because that's covering story aspects that I don't want to mention just yet. Instead, I'll pivot back onto talking about the visual aspects of this game, because I think they are worth picking apart in greater detail. For 1998, Metal Gear Solid is quite the looker. Everything has a defined aesthetic that makes it all work. It's not exactly colourful and vibrant, though it can use colour when it sees a purpose in doing so. Instead, much of the time playing the game is spent seeing a lot of greyish tones. The greys of metal boxes and surfaces, the greys of concrete walls and floors, the greys of basic furnishings, the brownish greys of rocks and the white of untarnished snow give the game an appearance that might seem unappealing, but that's just the stage. And to be fair to this game, there are some environments that make use of colour and lighting to give the game an unusual sense of character, especially in the furnace and warehouse areas that come late on in the game. But generally speaking, they are not at all regular, and greyer shades are most common. The game makes extensive use of dithering too to get the shades of colours that you ordinarily can't get on a PlayStation. Granted, it tends to make up a good amount of greys and browns, but generally speaking it does have an amount of visual distinction across the board thanks to the dithering. The things that fill the environment though are a mite more colourful. Whilst the environments can often look like Anton Corbijn had worked on them, the entities that fill them out give them an amount of animation and life that make them look a good bit less dark and dreary. NPCs and characters in particular give the otherwise static environment a sense of life. For example, notice how in the start of the game that the fog of your breath is visible, what with it being cold as sin in the middle of nowhere, also known as Alaska. Also, notice the animations of these people. They seem quite lifelike in their behaviour and have simple idle animations for when they're just keeping an eye out. And that's before you go into cutscenes, where animations take on a very different appearance. Whilst you don't get many details on the heads of characters, such as no mouth movements or even really much in the way of eyes, it does enough with what it has by simply moving the head about to give the appearance of that character talking. The camera also moves about to provide a particular mood for the situation, and characters will gesture in conversation or look as though they're interacting with an environmental entity, like a console or a terminal. There are also the codec conversations, which take up a considerable amount of time in your game, as they provide story and background details, objectives, and a whole mess of other things for you to worry about. They're presented like a video conference call, where two people seem to look into their webcam and talk one after another. The character portraits are drawn courtesy of artist Yoji Shinkawa, and it helps define the look of the game in a bold way. There's a sense of wispy surreality to it all, and the portraits help convey it. They also do a very good job of tracking the emotional state of the character at that point, be it a simple chat or a heated argument or surprise or just outright panic. The expressions convey the whole spectrum of emotion brilliantly. From a technical aspect, Metal Gear Solid is also pretty good, though definitely not perfect. To begin with, it has a resolution that's entirely in 240p, so there's no faffing around with resolution switching, thankfully. It does, however, have a slightly lower resolution than most PlayStation games. Whilst it has 320 pixels along the horizontal, the image is 224 pixels tall, 16 pixels fewer than the usual 320 by 240. For context, this is the base resolution of the Sega Mega Drive. Perhaps the intent was to reduce load on the graphics processor? Or was it a directorial decision to provide the appearance of a slightly wider frame than usual? Either way, it's a little odd, though I suspect there may be a balance of both at play. I say that because the game can slow down when things get a bit busy. The game slows down so that it can draw the frames it can when you're looking in first-person mode or around corners, though the normal perspective from above Snake appears to be just fine, with little in the way of slowdown. The game runs at 30 frames per second mostly, though of course slowdown will affect and reduce it a bit. When moving around, it's never usually a thing you think about, but combat situations can get interesting. Since I've covered most of what's going on as far as the game's visuals are concerned, I'm going to talk about the audio now. Now, usually I'll talk about the sound effects first, then cover the music, but I'm going to go about this slightly differently this time. The game makes extensive use throughout of background music. In cutscenes there is a sweeping, tense, almost mysterious sounding score to keep the flow of things going, and regular gameplay features its own music, though the two soundtracks are quite distinctly different in their sound. A sizable chunk of Metal Gear Solid's music is composed by Tapi Iwase, credited as Tapi, along with Kazuki Muraoka. When you're running around the halls within the base of Shadow Moses Island, you're hearing background audio that was handled by these two. The game's main theme, which saw extensive play in the trailers for this game, is credited to Tapi, and it features regularly in the series for a few entries, though it was dropped sometime due to the possibility there may have been a little plagiarism going on. Anyway, the background music. It covers a diverse spread of styles, and you get a good taste of what to expect from the first few minutes of the game in the dock, with its slightly oppressive pounding synths, breathy whooshes, and choir, all of which serve to set the mood of, yeah, you're gonna have a time of this, buddy. Ominous choirs, pulses, and synthesized strings make up a lot of the soundtrack, especially when it comes to areas that make up more notable spaces, rather than simple areas you're traversing through to get to the next objective. When the game wants to toy with atmosphere, however, it will. The caverns underground, which have a few wolf dogs roaming around, has the howls of said wolf dogs for its background ambience, combined with a low-set choir just on repeat. Occasionally, those synthesized strings can have the sound of being struck a bit suddenly, giving it an almost pizzicato-like sound, which in turn helps to generate the feeling of being a sneaky sneakster sneaking around and being a nuisance to everyone. Some places can be utterly mortifying though. Whilst I'll hold off on detailing Psycho Mantis a bit, since that hops way into spoiler territory, I'll at least make mention of Mantis' Hymn, a low, eerie, funereal track that's laid thick with atmosphere. Oh, and there are times where the atmospheric soundtrack can sound like it was taken off the cutting room floor for a survival horror game, as is probably the case for the corridor leading into the computer lab in the nuclear warhead storage building. Metal Gear Solid has a way of making the player uneasy, and how could I talk about the music in this game without even mentioning the frantic alert theme? If ever there was a music track that told you you're in the wrong neighbourhood, kiddo, this would surely have to be it. For now though, I'm going to shift for a moment towards talking about the music used in cutscenes. The cutscene music is a little different in how it makes use of a more orchestral sounding score than what the in-game background atmospherics do. A part of that is to do with how the cutscene music was outsourced to a company that operates out in Hollywood, with Gigi Moroni heading up the composition, and whilst it's not nearly as distinct, it does sound good. The background music sways with the cutscenes and flows with what happens on the screen. It matches up to work really well in fitting in with the events on screen, but on the whole, it's a soundtrack that, compared to the regular in-game soundtrack, works for what it is, but isn't exactly something you would play for the hell of it. With that said, I will make mention of the game's closing theme, which appears as a motif at times in the soundtrack itself. The best is yet to come. Just in case things didn't seem already unusual enough, this track is sung entirely in Gaeilge by Irish singer Aoife Niara. Aoife was most active in the 1990s and 2000s, with her self-titled 1996 album having released with quite a bit of acclaim, helped in no small part thanks to the album being produced by another legendary Irish singer, Clannad vocalist Moya Brennan. Originally written in Japanese by the song's composer Rika Muranaka, the song was translated into Gaeilge, and as a result the lyrics impart an eerie yet almost soothing quality to the music. I guess it really is like a Clannad song, even if Moya Brennan wasn't involved in this. As far as composition goes, it starts out quiet with minimal instrumentation, but before long it begins to ramp up with the introduction of traditional Irish folk drums, pipes, a bouzouki, and, as is natural with Irish folk music, a fiddle. It is a beautiful track that is among my favourite songs in games. It is an unusual piece of music to feature in a game with as much grit as Metal Gear Solid, but the sheer juxtaposition in style between the grey, icy walls of Shadow Moses Island and the serenity of The Best Is Yet to Come works in a very beautiful way. For those who remember the time I did uploads of awesome video game music, it shouldn't come as a surprise that this was the very first upload I did. I genuinely love this track, and it helps pull the entire soundtrack together to create a stirring audio-visual feast. Simply incredible. That having been said, I am not at all done with the audio here. I have merely covered the music side of things, such as the amount of stuff to cover in this game. Now I'll move on to talking about the general sound design, which has its own nuances. We'll start out with the sound effects, which consists of a fair number of things. You'll encounter quite a lot of different sound effects during your time playing Metal Gear Solid. Explosions, gunshots, footsteps, dog noises, sounds of electronics. There is a rather detailed bank of sounds the game pulls from. There's a crispness to the audio that helps it sound as good and as distinct as it does. It doesn't get excessively noisy at all, and even when it does get noisy, the particular sounds are pretty easy to pick out when they play out. Explosions are quite loud, of course, but you do also get the admittedly small assortment of gunshot sounds which, whilst also loud, are quite distinct from each other. The PSG one doesn't sound much like the FAMAS, which in kind doesn't sound much like the SOCOM pistol, which in kind doesn't sound much like the suppressed SOCOM pistol. Of course, it's hard to talk about sound in Metal Gear games without mentioning the sound effect that plays when an enemy spots you. It's as iconic as it is startling, for if you're not paying attention, you're going to get a rather rude awakening. The alert sound effect, combined with the panic-inducing music that follows immediately on from that, forces you to pay attention and do what you can to get out of there. It's because of this effect in particular that you'll know that you're in trouble. As for other sound stuff, perhaps the big thing to talk about is voice acting. All dialogue in Metal Gear Solid is fully voiced, with very few bits of text, such as flavor text for items and mission logs, not being voiced. Video game voice acting was in its relative infancy, as prior to that point, games didn't really have the capacity to handle it. Games like Star Ocean for the Super Famicom had little bits of incidental voice acting, but it was heavily compressed to make it fit on a cartridge, and the end result lacks a lot of clarity. Mind you, some games for the PC featured acting of different forms, such as voice acting, live action acting, and so on, to help tell the story. Early efforts were a bit awkward and could be pretty bad sometimes, but those were the standards of the day.
What's wrong with us?
Well, we're fine, but I've been thinking we should watch the outsides.
That's stupid. People to worry about there on the inside.
No, then you catch them before they get inside, you taffer.
Oh!
At least, those were the standards in English works, but in Japan, standards tended to be a little bit higher. Evidence of this comes when you look at the Japanese cast list here, as Metal Gear Solid features some very well established names of the era. Solid Snake himself is portrayed by acclaimed actor Akio Otsuka, and if his name is not immediately familiar, you have probably heard him as Bato from Ghost in the Shell, Gato from Mobile Suit Gundam 0083 Stardust Memory, and Captain Nemo from Nadia the Secret of Blue Water. Wait, Nemo? Oh no, it's happening again. Otsuka provides a firm voice to a character who, whilst known for his short, rapid-fire sentences and propensity to respond with questions, can go from compassionate and almost gentle to aggressive and stern, almost at the turn of a dial. Little wonder he is iconic as Snake in Japan. Other characters have different voice actors, such as Naomi Hunter being voiced by Hiro Mitsuru, Takeshi Aono as Campbell, Koji Totani as Revolver Ocelot, and Liquid Snake being voiced by Banjo Ginga. All of these voice actors, or seiyuu in Japanese, have sizable credits to their name and are well known in Japan, especially at the time of the game's launch in 1998, such as the nature of celebrity culture in Japan. By and large, I can't really think of a way to fault the voice acting. It works really well in conveying the story and giving the characters their distinctive voices that players in Japan have grown to love and appreciate. But in the West, things are a little different. We didn't get the Japanese voiceover, and instead we got an English language cast. Because of this, it is time for me to introduce something to you. You see, up to this point I have been reviewing the original 1998 Japanese release of Metal Gear Solid, and as a package it's pretty decent. However, when it made its way to Western shores, the voice acting was redone with English language actors. Thus enters Metal Gear Solid Integral. It's an updated re-release to the existing Metal Gear Solid, with a number of additions and some considerable changes to content that I will go into greater detail about later. But before I do, I want to make clear that this is the version of the game that I will be covering from this point on, in part because of one of its key features over the original game: English voice acting. The English voice acting features a few names that may have been heard of at the time of the game's release, but generally speaking, you're most likely to know about the voice actors largely because they were in this game, though that shouldn't diminish their ability as voice actors. Alongside voice actors like Jennifer Hale, who voices Dr. Naomi Hunter, you also have Paul Eading as Campbell and Cam Clark as the voice of Liquid Snake, all three actors being of particularly prolific note. One quirk of the English cast, however, is that the actors aren't credited by their actual names, owing to some uncertainty over whether they would be allowed to use the names that they used as part of the Screen Actors Guild, as it didn't make clear what to do with video game performances. The only actor whose real name was used in the credits was that of David Hayter, who, as it happens, voices our protagonist Solid Snake. And just as Akio Otsuka is iconic as Solid Snake to Japanese players, David Hayter is iconic as Solid Snake to players of the English language version. Hayter gives Snake his trademark Chainsmoker voice, a deep, husky sound that shows him as being battle-hardened and more than ready to take anyone down. He has a voice so gravelly that not even Carlos Sainz Jr. can resist. Another quality of the English voice acting is that the characters have accents relevant to their nationality. It should be noted, of course, that these voice actors are from either America or Canada, so for the most part, the accents are generally just put on. For what it's worth, Mei Ling having a slight Chinese accent isn't really a big deal, given Kim Ma-guest's Vietnamese heritage, but for the most part it's a bit of a quirky detail. But to review, Integral features English language voice acting featuring the use of accents for a number of characters. Naomi Hunter speaks in a received pronunciation like English accent, Liquid Snake's accent is mostly English sounding but otherwise well travelled, Mei Ling has a modest Chinese accent, Nastasha Romanenko has a thick Ukrainian accent, further bolstered by her love of smoking cigarettes, and Sniper Wolf has a Kurdish accent. The accents for the characters are tied to their ethnicity and origins, and by and large, it does work quite well. There's a reverence and respect for different cultures in this game's dialogue and voice acting, with nothing that my pasty white self picked up on as being much of a problem. So on the whole, I do think that the Japanese voice acting is pretty good, and by and large, the English voice acting is also pretty good. There isn't really much I picked up on that was out of place or not as good as it could have been, outside of a very small handful of things. Certainly not enough to worry about anyway. And perhaps the neatest thing about this version having English dialogue? It also means that you can play this game with English subtitles for said dialogue, or the original Japanese subtitles. No Japanese voiceover, presumably because space constraints, and only the dialogue is translated into English, but you know something? Given the question of which of the two versions of the game to buy, between the original 1998 release or the Integral release, I would without a doubt recommend Integral above the original. Allow me to explain why. The original Metal Gear Solid was a pretty packed affair. It came on 2 discs, had an engrossing story that gripped you, was a blast to play, and the game itself lasted about 8 hours. Now granted, there is an amount of replayability, if only really because you can unlock a small handful of Easter eggs, something that the series has a reputation for. Plus there are 2 endings to unlock. But on the whole, Metal Gear Solid's original Japanese release, despite being pretty packed as I said earlier, is retrospectively bare. It was the sort of game that you would rent from a Blockbuster, or if you were like me, Choices, and finish it over the weekend, such was its relatively short length and limited scope for replays. Because of this, there was an effort made to remedy this by including different things to do. Firstly, the original Metal Gear Solid had no difficulty selection. You only got the one difficulty mode throughout the game and it didn't change at any point. Integral gives you an option of 4 different difficulty options off the bat, and here you find out that the original game's difficulty is this version's easy difficulty. Very easy difficulty gives you a suppressed MP5 right off the bat, with unlimited ammunition, so it basically trivialises much of the game, but if you're looking to just play for the story, then hey, you can do a lot worse. Normal provides you with an experience that will test you a bit, but not too hard, and perhaps the big thing with this is how damaging things can be now. The only real problem is you've still got that pesky Soliton radar in the corner for you to stare at and make things borderline trivial. Play on hard difficulty and you will get a challenge. You're relying on what you are able to see around you, which means using the first person view as much as you feasibly can, and generally speaking it can be a hellish task at times, but god is it good. There is also the infamous extreme difficulty, which provides you with the most punishing test of your stealth abilities, with items in the environment that you can only collect once and only one ration readily available to you, which barely heals you to begin with, as well as the complete removal of the Soliton radar, but I'm too chicken hat for that. On top of all of this, if you have a save file for the original Metal Gear Solid on your memory card, you will unlock an alternative game mode, which mixes up enemy and camera positioning throughout the game, giving you a few unexpected surprises if you're not paying attention. There are a bunch of other features in this game that I want to talk about too. There are a few things that are a bit goofy, such as the pocket station thing you can do, but since I don't have one, I won't be going any further into it. Integral also includes another game mode that is unlocked upon beating the game at least once. Activate it from the special section of the main menu, and you can play the game in a different perspective. Double press the triangle button, and Snake will enter a first-person view, just like before, but unlike before, where you were stuck in place and could only look around, you can now move about and even use weapons. It's not the smoothest experience, however. You can't simply pop in and out of first-person view with a single tap of the triangle button, picking items up is awkward, there's only Japanese subtitles available, and bosses don't work in the way that they were intended to, but for what it is, it's quite interesting to play. Most of this, however, is stuff that Japanese players would generally be non-fussed about having, besides maybe the difficulty options. Really, the biggest draw to the Integral release is its third disc, the VR disc. Now, some of the details on this disc I will hold on to until there is a sensible time to talk about it, but this disc was made available separately later on in the West. You get 300 VR missions of many different types, and they give you considerable practice with different aspects of the game, particularly in sneaking and combat. Given the above, I've made a case for why you ought to get the Integral release over the original if you want to collect any of the Japanese releases of Metal Gear Solid, though this isn't to say the original isn't worth considering. However, allow me to talk about a particular aspect I haven't dug into much yet. You see, Integral, including English voice acting, as well as an option for Japanese or English dialogue subtitles, gives it a tremendous advantage in accessibility to those who don't have the best grasp in Japanese. Now, I am a pretty big fan of the series, and I've played the first Metal Gear Solid a lot, and just playing it for this review, I've done multiple playthroughs. However, there is a reason I've done it in Integral mostly. It's easier to follow with the English dialogue. Metal Gear Solid is pretty legendary for making use of stuff outside of the game's world, such as messing around with the peripherals on the system itself, and that's before mentioning it using stuff like the game's own packaging. If you played the original and you didn't have a great understanding of Japanese, would you know how to contact a particular character? Or how to take down a particular boss? I'm closing in on spoiler territory talking about this, but on the whole, the original game is made for Japanese players exclusively. Integral, however, makes use of the stuff that was made for the Western release. If you speak English, then it has pretty much all you need in order to get to grips with the game and everything in it. Well, almost everything. There is still a non-trivial amount of Japanese text in the game itself, no matter what, with no option to change that text into English along with the subtitles. Item descriptions are only in Japanese with no English text for them. You also get mission logs that give you something to refer to when loading a save, which is especially helpful if you need a reminder of what happened when you last played the game. The downside to this is it's also exclusively in Japanese. In spite of these, I would still, without hesitation, recommend Integral over the original game, because the use of English dialogue makes the situations I mentioned earlier simply a matter of connecting the dots, rather than referring to dictionaries that you can't even properly read all that well. Actually, why do I have these? Anyway, pretty much the only reason I was able to play through the Japanese release with little issue was in part due to it being in easy difficulty as the default, but also because I've played it so much at this point that it's automatic for me. I don't need to think about what I'm doing all that much. In any case, the Integral release is just great. If you must pick between the two versions of the game, go with Integral over the original if you can. The original is still Metal Gear Solid, but if you don't know the game well, you better know Japanese at least. It's at this point, however, that I will be delving into stuff about this game that could constitute spoilers. I won't go too far into the story itself, and much of what I do cover will largely be out of context. If you wish to avoid all of that, then the review's over. The game is chock full of stuff that just referencing certain bits of it tells so much about the game. If you really want to avoid any sort of mention of spoilers, then this video is basically over for you with the message of get Metal Gear Solid, it's pretty great. On the other hand, if you're interested in some of the finer details as they pertain to the game's progression, characters, bosses and elements and themes of the story, then let us not delay any further. To get into the meat of progression, I think I should start out in a more generalised manner, because the game at least starts out in a somewhat predictable manner. I'll try to keep it somewhat brief to start out. The core loop of progression, at least early on, is you get an objective to find someone or something, and you have to make your way towards it, avoiding the many guards and hazards along the way. You do encounter the person or thing you are looking for, but in doing so you might have a boss fight to deal with. Once that's done, you get to talking, something may or may not happen, and you get your next objective. This is your standard tried and tested pattern of progression that not just this series, but gaming in general has made use of for a very long time. Things are simple as they start out, and you do get into a bit of a rhythm as you go along in playing the game. The problems begin, however, when the game expects you to backtrack through past areas in order to continue your mission. Metal Gear Solid is not the longest game in the world. It can be beaten within 8 hours if you don't skip cutscenes and conversations, but it does pad its length out in rather unnecessary ways. As an example, you need to acquire a sniper rifle to deal with a particular boss. In order to get it, you need to traverse all the way back from several areas to get it, and it can feel like a slog. It's interesting really, because you only have to go through about 7 different places in order to get it, and then those same 7 to get back. When I put it like that, you might be thinking, well, what's the big deal? Well, it's still a very long way to go. Some rooms are bigger and take longer to traverse, like the caverns and the canyon, especially with the hazards around, so it's something that requires an amount of care to traverse. You also have to hope that elevators don't take too long. It doesn't only try backtracking the one time though. There are a few sequences where backtracking plays a part, some more egregious than others. As an example, you've got to get to the snowfield from Communications Tower B, but the elevator doesn't work. You try the stairs, but they're out. You've got to go back up to the elevator. You then have to go all the way upstairs, deal with a helicopter on the roof of the tower, go down the stairs again to the elevator, and now you can progress after an ambush in the elevator. It's all a bit of a time sink that doesn't really respect you or your time. Perhaps the most egregious example of backtracking in Metal Gear Solid being an exercise in wasting time, however, can be found in the little device called the PAL key. Now, throughout much of the game, it's explained to you that 3 keys are needed to disarm the weapon that the terrorists claim to have in their arsenal. This little dingus thing turns out to be the one and only card you really need, and because of classical science fiction contrivances, in order to make use of it, you have to change the temperature of the card in order to use it on the 3 different terminals in the command room. But then all of a sudden you lose your PAL key. It ends up falling all the way down to the bottom of the hangar, and you have to go and get it, and this is where the proper funny nonsense starts. You have to find the key and make sure no rats have eaten it. If they have, then I hope you've got a Claymore mine at hand, because you're going to be needing one to vaporize the rat that ate your key. You then have to go all the way up, use the key on the terminal, go all the way back down, find somewhere cold, wait a while, go back up, use the key on the terminal, find somewhere hot, go an even greater distance back, then make your way back to the control room after it's hot to use the key on the terminal again. On top of that, to make it all longer, you get codec conversations that are there to plant seeds of doubt in your mind. But all in all, it wears thin quickly. Moments like these can make people wonder if it's worthwhile to continue playing, and whilst I can put up with it, it's still not the optimal way to get stuff done. The game also makes use of a number of set-piece moments to break up the runaround, which is fine, but I do have to wonder why the game began to rely on them late on into the game. This is mainly the case for when you reach the communications towers, where you have to deal with a bunch of enemies chasing you up Tower A, then you rappel down the tower, head over to Tower B, climb all the way up, take the helicopter out, then head back down in the elevator that wants to kill you, then you have to do a sniper fight. It's just set piece after set piece with minimal let up. And sure, some of these are pretty good set pieces, like the fight with Sniper Wolf and the fight with the helicopter is entertaining, but on the whole, it was a lot of stuff in a small space of time. Compared to the quieter parts earlier on in the game, like where you were just trying to find your way into the offices in the nuke building, you will miss that focused pacing when, approaching the end of the game, things either go too quickly or too slowly. Enemy placement also gets really weird as the game progresses. Early on in the game, larger areas like the heliport at the start can have 2 or 3 soldiers in them, and you have to avoid or otherwise deal with them. When the game starts moving towards set pieces though, it gets weird. Snake even comments to Hal just how quiet the storehouse for Metal Gear Rex is, and you only encounter one enemy throughout the entirety of the room. Hal explains it's because they're ready to launch, but surely you'd want 2 or 3 doing the rounds at least, to make sure no sneaky bugger gets around, right? Really, the enemies, their patrols and the engagement both of these bring are what I'm probably missing when the game leans towards set pieces. Otherwise, things just feel empty and, for want of a better way to put it, boring. I'm also going to be a bit critical of the game's difficulty here, or to be exact, the difficulty curve. Let's look at how things start early on and then look around the mid-game when you've got a fair amount of stuff to your person, all for an idea of what's going on with this game's difficulty curve. When you're starting out your game, you don't have much on you. No weapons besides your fists, a really small health bar, and setting off an alarm is basically a death sentence. The early game can be brutal to newcomers unaccustomed to stealth games. When you've made a good amount of progress in the game, with a lot of tools at your disposal and options for how to handle encounters, along with a big health bar, you can virtually burn through enemies and obstacles like they're nothing. The difficulty curve is backwards. The game becomes mostly easier as you make your way along, and until a certain point, the challenge doesn't really get back to a level resembling something particularly difficult, or at least not in the normal difficulty that this review is running on mostly. Really, it's not until you encounter bosses that things begin to get tricky, so perhaps it's the best time to shift the conversation to boss fights. Throughout this game, you'll encounter a good number of boss fights that will test you in a number of ways. Once again, it gets a little spoilery, so I'll try not to focus too much on specifics within the story, and I'll give a bit of an overview on boss fights in general, although there are a couple that I do want to go over specifically. I'll leave them towards the end though, so we can talk about the general rules before tackling those in detail. For the most part, you won't be going into these fights with much in the way of options other than to fight. Sneaking has virtually no value in most of these fights, with the exception of one that I'll talk about in a bit. Instead, in every one of these encounters, you'll have to fight using the different things available to you and whittle down your opponent's health to 0 using tactics that are appropriate for the challenge at hand. The first boss encounter in the game is with Revolver Ocelot, who has quite the fixation with his Colt single-action army. It's a pretty simple arena with a hazard in the middle that will kill you and end the fight if you run into it, and Ocelot has a knack for being able to ricochet his bullets off the walls. You then get a really unusual fight with a tank. Ordinarily, you'd take down a tank with some sort of heavy ordnance, maybe with a missile launcher if you had one at hand. So how do you deal with a tank in this game? Grenades. You throw a grenade at it and hope that they end up in the hatch. Yeah, I've got nothing for this. The The first unique fight, and no I can't call the tank nonsense a fight, is the fight with the cyborg ninja. Fighting this thing is quite the exercise in your melee skills, since gunfire is useless against it. It uses its sword to slash those silly little bullets. Eventually, it begins to modify the fight by introducing a few twists, using its camouflage system to hide a bit, before eventually making things incredibly annoying at the end with its berserk mode. It gets frustrating with how damaging it gets at the end. And then comes one of the most infamous fights in the whole of the Metal Gear franchise, Psycho Mantis. He has a bit of a reputation for being one of those fights that gets put onto lists of the best boss battles in history, in no small part because of how mind-bending the encounter is. Mantis will take the time to read your game save status, determine your playstyle, and even read the contents of your memory card, so he can see that you've totally played through all the police notes before beginning this tale. Eventually though, you fight him proper and nothing works. He dodges all you can throw at him, and he floats around being all sorts of annoying. So what do you do here? Well, let's see if the guys on the other end of the codec know what to do. Okay, so they're suggesting that we try somehow to make it impossible for Psycho Mantis to read our mind and that we should clear it. Okay, that tells me nothing. How about that he's reading what the controller's doing? That is only helping me so much. We're going to need something more to work with here. Okay, so apparently I just need to swap things around so that the controller is plugged into port 2, and this way I can continue the fight because he can't read my mind now. Alright, sweet, that works.
Wait, no, hang on, what?
You're telling me I had to change where the controller was plugged in? Who thinks of this stuff besides Kojima? How does anyone go as far as to think, hey, you know what would be great? Get the player to move towards the console and fiddle with it. I defy anyone to tell me they thought to do anything like this without knowing beforehand, and without assistance from the kernel, because there is simply no way you realistically could. Anyone who changed the controller port in playing this boss either got the instruction from the kernel, or already knew what to do, or had absolutely no idea of what to do and thought, oh the hell with it, what else am I gonna do? Snark aside, however, I will admit something. This encounter is pretty great with how it doesn't just destroy the fourth wall, but drives a JCB right through it, especially with how much of the console it makes use of. From the memory card to the controller ports themselves, and who knows, if it were possible, maybe the TV would be affected. Speaking of heavy machinery, you get to fight a Metal Gear in Metal Gear Solid, Metal Gear Rex. It's a big lump that requires you to be mindful of your positioning, as it can be especially damaging. Once you get into a rhythm with the fight though, it becomes manageable and a bit less terrifying, though that's down to the difficulty curve again. My favourite battle in the game though has to be with Vulcan Raven. He's a big lad equipped with a big gun, and if he spots you, you are big dead. So you have to tackle him in a considerably more stealthy way than before. Fighting him head on is a dangerous task, so you have to use the environment to your advantage. Hide yourself behind some of the containers away from him and use whatever weapons you have available, be they your Nikita launcher, your claymores, your grenades, your C4. Basically anything explosive will work. It's a cool little cat and mouse style fight that I enjoy in this kind of game. This is the only battle in the game that really does anything with its stealth mechanics, so this simple sort of execution works to its advantage. I like it. One thing that I know isn't universally loved, however, is the writing in this game. You see, Hideo Kojima has a bit of a reputation for his style of writing that can regularly overtake the game itself. When you look at games such as Snatcher and Police Notes, you start to get why exactly his games are as wordy as they are, because he provides a level of detail that can only really be described as encyclopedic. But this comment is not necessarily meant to be taken as either praise or criticism. When it comes down to it, his games contain a lot of stuff in them that can either be circuitously repetitive, descriptive to a point of absurdity, and at odds with what people might be playing the games for in the first place. Although it's worth stressing that this stuff isn't inherently bad. There's a Haruki Murakami novel called 1Q84, and the language in that book is repetitive and relies heavily on descriptions to a degree that I can only really call pornographic. Hell, in some cases it literally is pornographic. It's a really long book, and it took me a month and a half to read it, and thinking about the two, They both have a surprising amount in common in terms of the level of detail and how it can repeat on itself in the way that it does. However, one of these things I like, and one of these I don't particularly like. I think the main reason why I like Metal Gear Solid but don't like 1Q84 is down to the pacing. For as repetitive as Metal Gear Solid's writing can be, it has a pretty rapidly told narrative that helps to give the story a bit of focus. Most of the extraneous details are confined to stuff that you have to go out of your way to find. You have to call the likes of the Colonel, Miller, Nastasha, and so on to even get half of the lore surrounding the world, and the stuff you're told in conversations with certain characters is usually at least somewhat relevant to immediate events. To put this all another way, in 1Q84 you have no choice but to accept that you're going to be told about a whole bunch of stuff you don't exactly care about, and several times over at that. In Metal Gear Solid, however, you only have to deal with some of it, surely not to a big enough extent to make it a deal breaker, and especially not in comparison to later entries in the series. Most of the stuff that you will get from conversations you have to have are in some way relevant to the story, whether those conversations be about the motivations of different characters, or even trying to get particular characters to focus on the mission at hand in spite of themselves. It also has a surprising knack for keeping you guessing on a few things. If there's one thing the Metal Gear series does a great job with, it's making it apparent that things should never be taken at face value. For example, you end up captured at some point, and you have to keep yourself alive by either enduring or yielding to your captor's torture. You can do one or the other, but the outcome that results from this will come back to make itself clear at the end of the game, determining just what happens. On top of that, characters can be deceptive bastards, hiding behind identities that aren't theirs, and doing things that put you in serious trouble. The game makes clear the further along you go that things are never to be taken at face value. Each and every time I come back to this game, more and more things show up to me. Be it something as simple as an Easter egg or a gameplay feature that I didn't notice before, new things reveal themselves to me when I play Metal Gear Solid. When it comes to the core idea of the games in the series, each game from Metal Gear Solid on can be summarised with a single word concept that ties the whole of each game together, although this naming scheme largely came into effect after the release of Metal Gear Solid 3 Snake Eater. As an example, Metal Gear Solid 2's Sons of Liberty's focus on the passage of ideas between people netted it the conceptual name of meme. In Metal Gear Solid, the focus of one's origins and what it can lead to gave it the conceptual name of gene. Essentially, the game's writing consists of a great deal of talk regarding topics of a genetic matter, such as one's parentage, the passing of genes onto future generations, and some similar, if not directly related topics, like the environment of one's upbringing and how that shapes them as a person. Topics like those also involve concepts like genetic engineering, encompassing a fairly broad category of aspects, but this game focuses more on things like gene therapy, which had been performed on an entire group of people to enhance their inherent abilities, or cloning, as represented with the likes of Solid and Liquid Snake. Metal Gear Solid especially focuses on the idea of genetic destiny, the idea that your genetic background and makeup effectively predetermine how your life will unfold, with little in the way of options to affect the eventual outcome. It's an awfully fatalistic way of looking at life, and while there is a nugget of truth to this notion, you could think of things such as genetic disorders having an effect on how someone lives their life. Metal Gear Solid tries to make clear that you shouldn't just look within to determine how you live your life. Why should it matter how cytosine, guanine, adenine and thymine are arranged in your DNA structure? In some respects it might, but if you've got your health and your faculties about you, why should you be penned into one way of life just because of some prenatal draw in a genetic lottery that you had no hand in? The ending of this game makes the point that you shouldn't consign yourself to some idea of fate, especially when you can affect that fate yourself. Life isn't a biography that's been written before it's happened. It's an ever-changing experience whose end is a very long way away, one would hope. As a topic that has some degree of relation to genetics, Metal Gear Solid also makes a few cultural references. Not pop culture references exactly, although there are a few here as we'll touch on later, but more in the anthropological sense of things. The cultures of Native American and Arctic peoples, as well as their languages, appear occasionally, and the game makes clear what the setting is and why it's relevant to the people in this story. As an example, Vulcan Raven makes a number of references to things such as the World Eskimo Indian Olympics, and giving a basic idea of events such as the ear pull, which, if you had no idea about it, might seem quite daft. However, if you read up on the ear pull, things do click into place somewhat. Vulcan Raven's shamanistic nature gives Metal Gear Solid a rather unique and interesting way of handling cultural aspects that might otherwise go under the radar in other games. Looking into the different references is quite fun to me, and the game scratches a few itches as a result. However, the key thing with Metal Gear Solid as a game and as a series is that it is vehemently anti-war, and makes no apologies for that stance. Sure, there are a lot of action set pieces that make them exciting to play or watch unfold, and the games might have their comedic moments to offset the serious moments, but if there's one thing they don't make a rosy subject of, it's the effects of war. Hideo Kojima was born almost 20 years too late to have experienced the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki firsthand, but he did grow up at a time where relations between the United States and the Soviet Union were dancing on a knife edge. That Cold War paranoia creeped into the Metal Gear series quite quickly, even after the fall of the Berlin Wall in real life. The game simply went out of their way to make the situation appear worse to fit the narrative they wanted to portray. Metal Gear Solid's world is not a peaceful one. The world teeters on the brink of nuclear war, and everyone is seemingly sleepwalking into it. And although some world leaders are trying to make things less apocalyptic, it's not without pushback on some fronts, and others are simply trying to serve as doomsayers as much as anything. And that's before you dive into the aspects of war that affect different individuals. As an example, the cyborg ninja turns out to be Grey Fox, the same Grey Fox who had been killed in Metal Gear 2, but was somehow revived and, as though by Frankenstein, turned into an abomination, a being whose existence is an affront to nature. Naomi Hunter, a member of your support team, reveals to you late on that she had someone act as a brother figure to her in order to help her in her hardest moments as an orphan in Zimbabwe. That brother figure was Grey Fox, and channels her despair onto Snake for allowing him to be turned into this thing. And all of this is before you touch on the very real effects of war felt by people around the world in places racked by conflict, with such effects as decline in physical and mental health, displacement, forced migration, and other horrible issues. All this set dressing about technological progress, nanomachines, gene therapy, action sequences that look cool and are fun to play and watch. As cool to look and think about as all of that is, they're just a Trojan horse. They all hide the dark fact that war, plainly, simply, unequivocally, is devastating. So, to lighten the mood somewhat, let us go on about a few simpler things. Firstly, let me explain that I have been using the one save file on the integral version. I explain this because there is a new Game Plus feature of sorts, and after doing 2 runs of this game, you unlock new outfits. Of course, Snake is dressed up with a tuxedo, looking all dapper. Quite clearly it's a reference to 007, and given Kojima is a massive movie maniac, it would be rather alarming if he didn't make any sort of allusion towards James Bond in this game. Meryl gets a new outfit too. Well, it's more that she gets Snake's sneaking suit, but I suppose it's new in the grand scheme of things. The combination of Snake in a tuxedo and Meryl in a sneaking suit makes for one really bizarre mashup, all things considered. I do like it though. So for other things, let's talk about the things you unlock after each run. Without revealing the exact endings, I'll just say that with one you can unlock a bandana, and the other nets you a stealth camouflage module. The bandana endows you with unlimited ammunition, which can make certain encounters quite surreal. The stealth camouflage module is used to make navigating the world a lot easier in the end. It doesn't really work for bosses, but hey, it makes running around places somewhat trivial. Completing either run will also earn you a camera that you can make use of, to take photos of stuff in the environment and save onto your memory card. It's a fairly neat feature, if a bit gimmicky, but there is one thing that's great about this. You see, if you take a photo of particular things in the game, head over to the photo album and have a look at the photos, you might just give yourself a modest heart attack because your photos are haunted. There are over 40 ghosts in the game you can photograph, and you can even exorcise them if you so desire. There's a Moai statue in one of the rooms in the Nuke Building's B2 offices, a PlayStation in Hal's lab. The name Hal's lab is on the door that leads to it, with it all being a reference to HAL Laboratory, and all of that is just on the one floor of one building. The codec has a few secret channels, one of which is a simple comment from the game's developers, and another provides you with pieces of the Metal Gear 2 soundtrack in certain places. Speaking of the codec, we can mess about with Mei Ling. Contact her a few times without saving and she'll begin to get a little annoyed and start pouting. Do it again and she'll look like she wants to slap you. Do it another couple times after that and she'll stick her tongue out at you. She'll also admonish you for going into the women's toilets to go after Meryl, calling you a pervert and the like. This also works on another level, because depending on how quickly you get to her in the bathroom, she'll be in differing levels of undress. Just to hammer home that point, when you do find Meryl and leave the toilets to go towards the executive office, you can just stare at her for as long as you like, and she'll react with little bursts of dialogue. She even starts resembling Beetroot after a while, if you stare at her for long enough. On the topic of voyeurism, on the Integral version or the VR Missions disc, you can enter a mode where you can take photos of Naomi and Mei Ling just doing things. There's something kind of creepy about this, but hey, it's a thing you can do. Also, the better your completion rank in the main game, the closer you can get. There are also some alternative ways in how you can deal with bosses. For example, have you thought about using chaff grenades against a cyborg ninja? You can do that, they stun it in place, giving you the opportunity to attack with its defences down. You won't get many hits in, but it's a viable tactic to slow it down. Then there's Psycho Mantis. Who needs to switch the controller port? Just fire ad infinitum in his general direction with the FAMAS and a bandana, and you're probably golden. Even if it takes a lot longer, is considerably more risky because of the second to last phase, and just looks and sounds incredibly goofy. The one thing I don't like doing is the fight against Sniper Wolf. Here you can make use of the Nikita launcher to just make a complete mockery of the sniper fight you could have had. Hide behind a particular cliff, fire your rockets, and before long, you'll defeat Wolf in a way that I'm not at all proud of doing. And apparently there are ways in which you can take on Liquid Snake in the second phase of the Metal Gear Rex fight by using the sniper rifle, but I never quite got it to work. It's too awkward for me to really consider it a viable combat option, although it would be pretty funny. Aside from those things, you of course have an icon of the series, the cardboard box. There are 3 boxes in this game that you can collect, and each one can be used to provide a little portable hiding spot. They also serve a purpose for travel. Hop into the back of a truck with a box over yourself and wait a few seconds. You should find yourself heading towards where that box is intended for. It's basically a fast travel system. The box also serves a somewhat comedic purpose. When you're with Meryl in the underground caverns, after meeting up with her at the exit, you can slap her, equip a box, and one of the wolf dogs can urinate on the box in retaliation. There are so many little secrets and Easter eggs in Metal Gear Solid that I simply can't name all of them, not even the ones I discovered, without going back over the actual dozens of hours of footage I recorded for this review. It's genuinely chock full of stuff to find, so if you want to, you can give it a go. We've gone through a whole bunch of Metal Gear Solid, and I already explained what to expect in playing it, but there are a few things I will need to touch on regarding the different versions of the game you can get. I mentioned the original Japanese release for the PlayStation, which is good in its own right. It's relatively simple with not many options and, in comparison, is limited in its content, but all things considered, I can't really consider it that much of a problem for what it is. The Integral version of the game released the following year, providing a swath of changes that made the game more replayable for longer, courtesy of difficulty options, an alternative mode for people who have save data for the original Metal Gear Solid, a disc that contains a bunch of VR missions, and English voice acting with an option for English subtitles. Between these two versions, I heartily recommend Integral over the original for several reasons, partly because it's easier to play for someone not fluent in Japanese, and its content makes it more replayable for those looking for a different challenge. With all that said, if you do have the original, you've still got a really good game, and me telling you that the game got a better version shouldn't make you go, "Oh, this is rubbish now." That's not true at all. So let's talk about a few other different versions of the game that you can get and that I didn't really talk about so far. The NTSC and PAL versions of Metal Gear Solid are a sort of halfway house in terms of content. Naturally, there's the English voice acting with its English subs, but there's also a lot of content that didn't make it in the end, likely because the development process was still underway for the extra content, in particular the VR missions disc, or the special missions disc if you're in Europe, that would be released at a later date. Naturally, there are the technical differences between the two versions, with the PAL version running at 50Hz instead of 60Hz, which results in certain events taking a little longer to complete on the PAL version, but is still a solid enough version to play. So let's cover one particularly unusual version that released. Metal Gear Solid got a port for the PC in 2000, courtesy of developers Digital Dialect, and published with assistance from Microsoft. For the longest time it was pretty difficult to get, but Konami made the game available to buy via GOG in 2020. It's based on the Integral release and it consists of a number of modifications that you can expect of a PC game, such as a few graphical niceties like texture filtering and anti-aliasing, as well as different resolutions you can set for the game. It also just plays so much smoother and more consistently, but it's not without compromise. Firstly, the audio is a little bit messed up. Audio was downsampled from the originals, but it was done in a way that makes the audio sound lower in pitch compared to the PlayStation. Cutscene music especially sounds wrong, and the way the PlayStation handled audio made this version awkward by comparison with its occasional glitches. Also, this game was a bastard to try and record footage for. The GOG release runs in a DirectX wrapper, which helps the game work quite well for what it is, but my usual recording program for PC titles, the Xtori, doesn't play ball with it. Streamlabs thankfully works quite well with it, although I did have another issue where it chugs at times. With all of that being said, there is one other way to get the game. Because it took me as long as it did to make this review, we eventually ended up with the release of Metal Gear Solid Master Collection Volume 1. Consisting of the HD editions of Metal Gear Solid 2 Sons of Liberty and Metal Gear Solid 3 Snake Eater, it also consists of the original Metal Gear Solid with its VR missions content included as well, and is available for PC, Switch, PlayStation 4, PlayStation 5 and the Xbox Series consoles. If reviews are to go by, the games are still as good as they have ever been and still play like a dream, but the overall package has not fared as well as it could have, due to the bonus content being a bit convoluted to access, and the particular versions of the games being used not exactly living up to the standards of what is now the 9th console generation. The Switch version also has problems with performance and storage requirements. So with all of that in mind, if you saw anything in this that interested you with this game, then please be sure to give it a look. I'm sure it will be worth your time, whichever way you decide to experience it. However, by no means are we done with this review, because let me ask you a question. Did you know that this game got a remake? Yes, Metal Gear Solid got a remake in 2004 for the Nintendo GameCube called Metal Gear Solid The Twin Snakes. Allow me to regale you with the tale of how this remake came to be. In 2003, Konami announced that a remake of the original Metal Gear Solid was being released for the GameCube, and working on the project would not just be Konami's internal studios. Rather, a good chunk of the development would be handled by Canadian studio Silicon Knights. Silicon Knights had built up a respectable reputation for putting out some good PC games during the 1990s, and following Nintendo's positive reception to Blood Omen Legacy of Kain, Nintendo contacted them to see if they were interested in developing something to help give the GameCube a good start on mature titles. This led to the development of Eternal Darkness Sanity's Requiem, which got a very warm reception upon its release as a mind-bending horror game that heralded Nintendo's intention of aiming for a more mature audience with the GameCube than with prior consoles. One such fan of Silicon Knights' work was Hideo Kojima, who was unable to commit to working on the remake full-time and instead simply supervised the project whilst he was working on Metal Gear Solid 3 Snake Eater. The story goes that when Nintendo suggested remaking the game, Kojima pointed them towards Silicon Knights, and as fate would have it, studio lead Dennis Dyack was in the cafeteria of Nintendo's Kyoto offices when Shigeru Miyamoto and Satoru Iwata approached him with the proposition, and of course, he agreed. As a result, by March 2004, the game released with quite a lot of praise behind it, averaging at 85 out of 100 on Metacritic, and the game by and large has a pretty solid audience of fans around it, some of whom prefer this version over the original, though it didn't sell to the degree of the other mainline Metal Gear games. This tends to be a theme with remakes of games on the GameCube, sadly. Resident Evil suffered much the same fate, where the remake was largely well received, and indeed it was seen as the gold standard for video game remakes for almost 2 decades since its release, but it sold poorly and forced a few changes of direction. So let's have a quick overview of this version of the game whilst we have time. This won't be a full review as I don't want to draw attention away from the original game, and I've already been going on for too long already, so let's not waste too much time. To begin with the most obvious change, the graphics have gotten a marked upgrade. Gone are the boxy character models and wiggly potato heads, and in come well-detailed models with animations in many places. Characters move their mouths when they're talking, are more expressive with their animations than before, and overall the game's visual design is very faithful to the original in the right places, particularly in gameplay. There are moments where the visuals look genuinely impressive, particularly during cutscenes. Particle effects and impressive shader handling make this game look really bloody good, for the most part. The only problem I have with the visuals is that it can be very difficult to see at times with how dark even very slightly lit up areas can be. I play games on a monitor with a TN panel, so colours and blacks aren't particularly deep, so details can be lacking. As a result, I found myself occasionally moving around to get a better angle and see where I'm meant to go. Granted, I could have just used something like the night vision goggles if I needed to see, but that might be a bit much. Maybe this is why I missed that ladder in the communications tower. The Twin Snakes can run at 480p, which is great, and aims to run at 60 frames per second, but doesn't manage to do so all that often, especially not when things get a little busy. It's a bit disappointing how often it can struggle. Purely from a visual standpoint though, they've done a sound job of bringing everything up to snuff. It's possible now to tell what exact ammo type you're getting before you get near to picking it up, and devices like the thermal goggles and night vision goggles operate somewhat differently now. There is a spectre that clouds this game for me however, and it is probably the most infamous aspect of this game: the cutscenes. Since Kojima was otherwise occupied, he entrusted movie director Ryuhei Kitamura to handle them. Kitamura has a reasonable record as a director, who at that point completed a number of reasonably successful films such as Versus, Battlefield Baseball, and the live-action adaptation of the manga Azumi. I have the video game adaptation of the manga, just thought you'd like to know. Azumi's pretty good. Well, the manga is anyway. Anyway, he appears to have a sort of style to his work which can be polarising, and that has crept into this game's direction, as things can get really stupid really quickly, even by the standards that the cutscenes in later Metal Gear Solid games can fall to. Critics at the time derided the excessive use of bullet time. I wonder what was the movie's zeitgeist at the time that led to this. Anyway, it shows up here in a way that I can only call distracting. I will grant that things can get silly at times with later Metal Gear Solid games. The entire existence of Vamp in Metal Gear Solid 2 is itself a sign that Kojima doesn't take him all that seriously. And let's face it, the entirety of Metal Gear Rising is a ride. But there's absurdity, and then there's Cornball Supreme. This is Cornball Supreme. I don't get what the thought process was with this. I'm convinced these cutscenes made me dumber. It felt like I was losing IQ points watching these cutscenes, and you can tell because I'm acting like IQ is actually a thing. I had heard a theory that suggested this was done in such a way to tell the story from the perspective of Otacon, and that he overdramatised things to make it seem cooler. If that's the case, why in God's name would Otacon tell the story of him pissing himself not once, but twice? Why would you do that? What also does not help things is the length of the cutscenes now. In the original Metal Gear Solid, while delivery wasn't the quickest, dialogue was often conversational and spoken quickly enough. Here, the sentences are padded out by a few seconds of empty space for reasons that I don't get. Suspense? Or being told the bleeding obvious? It doesn't make any sense to me, it's just unnecessary. Now, in defense of some of the direction, there are a few cutscene moments that are pretty great. By and large, I don't mind some of the battle sequences between Snake and the cyborg ninja. They can be pretty good. Also, some of the comedic moments are quite good, like Ocelot trying to play with his gun and dropping it awkwardly. When Snake has a full-on tantrum because Uncle Ken forgot about buying him his packet of Mint Imperials, it goes from being funny to being just weird. Metal Gear Solid: The Twin Snakes is just weird. Moving on to another topic, because I've gone on at length about the cutscenes already, I will go over the voice acting side of things now. The game uses English voice acting, however it doesn't make use of the original files. I can explain why. Essentially, the original files that made up the integral and English versions of Metal Gear Solid had a problem that was easy to deal with on a PlayStation, but not so easy on a GameCube. According to David Hayter, the recording for the English voice acting was done in an apartment that had been turned into an impromptu studio. It meant that recording could be done reasonably quickly, but it also meant that sounds from outside could easily end up into the recording. Now, this was fine for the PlayStation, since it would be all compressed in such a way that it'd be hard to hear these noises. But had they used the audio files as they were, traffic noise would be somewhat audible, and compressing the files wouldn't really be desirable for what's meant to be the remake. As a result, everyone banded back together to redo the voice acting for the game. As such, David Hayter, Paul Eading, Jennifer Hale, Debbie Mae West, Cam Clarke, and all the others reprised their roles, although with one slight exception. Greg Eagles was the voice actor for both the DARPA Chief and the Cyborg Ninja in the original Metal Gear Solid. For the Twin Snakes, however, he only voiced the DARPA Chief, with the role of the Cyborg Ninja going to Rob Paulson, who you most likely know as Pinky of Pinky and the Brain, although he is otherwise ridiculously prolific. By and large, the reasons for redoing the voice acting are fair enough. If you've got bad files, then there's not a lot you can do with them. You may as well redo them, or you'll end up with something inferior in the end. However, I'm not sure I'm too impressed by the direction of the voice acting here. The only way I can really describe it is it feels overly stiff for most of the situations. Like it's trying to be dramatic in a subtle way, but somehow goes too far with the subtlety, to the point where you don't even have a ghost of any drama left. I'm not sure what's going on with this, but I don't like it. An example I'll pull from is one from fairly late on in the game. You're entering the elevator in Communications Tower B to head down towards the snowfield. The buzzer goes off, you wonder why, press the button to go descend in the elevator, and you get a call from Otacon warning you about what's about to happen. In The Twin Snakes, the only way I can describe how Christopher Randolph delivers his final line of the conversation is that he sounds like he's confusedly trying to ward off a stranger from trying to take one of his fries.
Look out, Snake! The guys who stole my stealth prototypes are in there with you!
For comparison, the delivery of the same line in the original Metal Gear Solid was considerably more urgent. It sounded like Otacon was genuinely scared for Snake's safety, helped in no small part by his codec portrait looking frantic. Another detail to pick up on was the reduction or otherwise dropping of accents for some characters. Liquid Snake and Sniper Wolf retain their accents, but Nastasia's has receded a bit. You can still hear it, but it's not nearly as prominent. Naomi and Mei Ling, on the other hand, have lost any and all shreds of their respective received pronunciation and Chinese accents. I'm not entirely sure why the accents were dropped, because they provided a degree of character to the game, on top of making each character sound distinct beyond just the voice talent. It also comes with the problem of characters just sounding a bit bored. I hear this especially with Campbell and Naomi. They sound rather robotic and disinterested in the events unfolding, despite their own investments in what's happening. Now, in Campbell's case, that's not too surprising, given Paul Eading portrayed the Colonel in Metal Gear Solid 2, and if you know, you know. But I don't know if there was something wrong with Jennifer Hale specifically, or just dubious direction, although I am leaning towards the latter on this one. Hale is just too prolific for mediocrity. So on the whole, it's not exactly bad. Let's face it, we've got games like Resident Evil setting the bar here. But given the choice between the two in terms of voice acting, I'll take the original, but I will happily acknowledge why the new voice acting exists. The last changes I want to cover involve the level design and gameplay, and this is an interesting topic to explore, as it allows the game to serve as an instruction manual on how grafting gameplay systems from one game into another one isn't inherently a recipe for success or cohesion. For context, the Twin Snakes was built in the Metal Gear Solid 2 engine, which would explain having a very similar user interface with a few modifications to bring it closer in line with Metal Gear Solid. That's not the only thing it explains, however. Metal Gear Solid 2 introduced a number of innovations to the series that became regular inclusions over time, such as providing the player with lethal and non-lethal options on how to proceed. Much like before, you have your usual assortment of weapons and items to carry you through the game, but it also includes the tranquilizer weapons from Metal Gear Solid 2, which is a sign of what to expect. In the original Metal Gear Solid, enemies could be killed and their bodies would disappear after a second. However, in Metal Gear Solid 2, bodies were persistent in the level, so if you killed an enemy or knocked them out, if you wanted to avoid them being spotted, you would have to hide them somewhere, like a locker. On top of that, they also have radios on them, which they use to communicate with their officers, and if they don't respond promptly, said officer will dispatch a team to check on them and make sure the disturbance isn't there anymore. Now, all of these are good mechanics as they provide you with a few hazards that enhance the feeling of being a sneaky dude, whilst also giving you more options on how to deal with situations. They also worked in Metal Gear Solid 2 specifically because the levels were designed in such a way that accommodated for this style of gameplay. In comparison, Metal Gear Solid The Twin Snakes uses mostly the same level design as the original game. Now, there are a few differences, such as enemy and camera placements, certain rooms having different appearances and redesigns to allow for new encounters and situations, but on the whole, the level design is basically the same. Let me use an example of the problem I'm referring to, specifically the nuclear warhead storage building. In the original Metal Gear Solid, it was designed to challenge you by forcing you to not use your weapons. In the Twin Snakes, however, you have an M9 tranquilizer gun with an installed suppressor, so you can simply knock the guards out like it's nothing. All of this is in spite of Naomi prohibiting you from using your weapons due to all this nuclear material here. Surely even tranquilizer rounds can cause a degree of havoc in here, no? I can't think of a reason as to why they wouldn't, and that's ignoring the fact that it just trivializes this entire room that was once a microcosm of the original game's challenge. On top of featuring tranquilizer weapons is a mechanic that Metal Gear Solid 2 also introduced, in that bosses often may be eliminated either lethally or non-lethally, as indicated by two separate life bars with a possible bonus from a non-lethal takedown. To be blunt, the tranquilizers feel phoned in here. I will grant that it made taking Sniper Wolf down the first time a little easier here, since the PSG-1T was in the B-1 officers and the nuke building, but it'd be a bit of a stretch to say that it justifies the existence of tranquilizer weapons in this game on the whole, and instead justifies cutting down on extraneous backtracking, which, to be fair to this game, it does try to do in places. For example, instead of running all the way down Communications Tower B to find out the stairs are broken in the original, you only have to go down a couple flights of stairs to know that the stairs are busted in the Twin Snakes. However, much of this is academic, as we still have the problem of Metal Gear Solid 2 mechanics in a game that's a remake of the original Metal Gear Solid, but has almost exactly the same level design. Why is there a grip gauge when we never really needed to hang over the sides of stuff before? Why are there laser tripwires that can be deactivated by shooting the panels near them? Why are the bosses in this game so much more of a mess than before? This game just leaves me stumped.
The ball is still active.
To add insult to injury, I have to explain something about how I got this game and why I didn't have it for the longest time. To be honest, I thought that it was just a really silly thing for me to own. I might be a Metal Gear fan, but this was not what I wanted. As such, I never got a copy, and having seen GameCube game prices rise as they have over the years, I simply could not care less about getting it. As an example, I went to a nearby city to have a walkabout, and we were in CEX. They had a PAL copy of the game on display for £75. At the time of writing, that's approaching $100. It's prices like these that drove me towards import gaming, because while a good chunk of money is spent just importing the games rather than on the games themselves, it would more often than not still work out cheaper in spite of that, and this game is a good example of that problem. I was already planning on getting a few things anyway, mainly Ace Combat stuff, so I chucked this copy of the Twin Snakes into my order. Do you want to know how much I spent on this game in particular? 4,200 yen. £23, $29. That said, I was supposed to have a copy arrive months ago, but I never got it because for whatever reason the postal company they were using weren't playing ball. Oh, and on top of that, they went out of business a few weeks ago. So much for that £60. So if I were to abbreviate the entirety of these few sections into a handful of words, I'll put it like this. Metal Gear Solid The Twin Snakes is an interesting example of a remake that was good on paper, but not as good in execution. Had they gone a little further off the ranch with it, modified the level design more than they did, changed boss battles up and so on, I could have seen it being more interesting than it ended up. As it is though, you have a game that, despite its best efforts, is relegated to living in the shadow of the game that birthed it in the first place. The amount of editing, rewriting, and stuff I've done for this review I haven't done in ages. I didn't edit the script nearly this much for the Ace Combat 3 Electrosphere review, and that went on for about 80 minutes. In the end though, if you have come away with something from this review, the one thing I hope more than anything is that you left with more respect for what this game did for video games since its launch 25 years ago. Metal Gear Solid is, without a shadow of doubt, truly legendary. It provided an impressively well realised setting, immersive gameplay, a story that still runs rings around people's heads to this day, and is also quite replayable, even if it can drag on a bit at times. The only real downsides with this game are the aforementioned dragging on of some things, like some cutscenes and the odd sequence that goes on for a bit too long. But on the whole, those are minor blips in the grand scheme of things, when the end result is still this good and this influential. To wrap this review up, I will go over the importability of this game as well as language requirements. I already touched on those briefly, but it won't hurt to reiterate them now that the meat of the review is done. Going through Neokyo, places like Mercari and Yahoo Auctions have a number of listings for the original release on its own for somewhere in the region of 1,500 yen, which lies somewhere in the region of $10 or £8. You're likely to find copies bundled with other Metal Gear games, however. The integral release has a lot of variance in the different releases it has, from the standard release like I have, to the Konami The Best version, to the PS1 Bucks release. The price remains much the same, however. Now, either version of the game can be bought on eBay if you are so inclined, but copies of the game can have dramatic price differences. Somewhere in the region of £20 to £30 before postage if you're in the UK, although in the US it seems to be generally less expensive, granting that it's not taking taxes into account, I don't believe. For language requirements, the original Japanese release is not an especially accessible game for those not attuned to the Japanese language, or haven't played this game to the point of it becoming muscle memory. If you struggle with Japanese but deal well with English, the integral release should be the one you target. English voice acting complete with subtitles helps here, and although a good amount of the game is still in Japanese, it still helps when you get clear instructions from different characters in a language you understand. Metal Gear Solid The Twin Snakes is a curio. You can get it if you want, and it won't be especially difficult to get a Japanese copy, but it is not at all a replacement for the original game that made games the way they are today. This is ordinarily where I would go through the other games in the series, but frankly, I've made enough mention of some of them already. I don't need to keep telling you about them, and besides, the chances are good that I'll cover them at some point in the future anyway. In any case, Metal Gear Solid is an impressive achievement in storytelling and presentation for not just the PlayStation, but for gaming in general, and it helped to bridge the media gap between film and video games in a way that many struggled to do earlier in the 1990s. For that, we can be most thankful. If you enjoyed this review, then please consider checking out my other works. My previous reviews were of the first 3 entries in Namco's Ace Combat series. There are some really good things in those games, I can tell you. If you have any suggestions of what I ought to cover, please let me know. I'm open to covering most things, and it helps a great deal with giving me ideas for what to focus on. I greatly appreciate it. Once again, my website isn't ready, I'm still working on it, but in the meantime there's my Twitter, for now anyway, to keep up to date with everything that I'm up to, and my Instagram for when I feel like posting on there. As ever though, this has been Daniel Learmouth. Sadi.